we'll talk about the student grievance policy. The university, like any institution, wants to be able to be in a position to deal with legitimate concerns raised by its members, in this case students. In the past, this had been fairly ad hoc. A student wasn't necessarily clear who they could complain to, what they needed to do in order to have a legitimate issue dealt with. So Senate last year passed the Student Grievance Policy and Procedures, and this seeks to detail clear processes by which students are able to raise legitimate concerns. A critical feature of the Student Grievance Policy and Procedures is that of procedural fairness, and that the students need to try and solve the problem at its origin in the first instance. There's a bit of a culture in the Pacific of people going straight to the top, to the VC or myself or the Minister or Consumer Council. This is not an appropriate way for students to behave. We want them to try and amicably reduce issues at the level there. They can, of course, then escalate that if they're not satisfied with that, but that's the first place to start. There's a very good reason for that. If a student goes straight to me or the VC or the Minister or somebody, then we need to find out what the situation is. So we're going to go straight back down to where the origin of the problem was. And because we can't make a decision unless we have the full information and facts about the case. And so that's not very efficient. If I'm travelling, the VC is travelling, then it can take days before we can get the necessary information which could have been got by the student going directly to the person concerned at the time. There's different types of grievances, and these are typically to do with concerns about decision making the university's made, or perceptions of unfair treatment, or concerns about facilities and so on. So they're really in two broad categories. One is administration issues and the other is academic issues. The students can complain about academic issues, but I would point out that oftentimes these complaints are challenging regulations that Senate has set. So if I take one example, we've had a number of concerns raised about or appeals against the 75% progression rule. That is a Senate-approved regulation. So an appeal against that is not likely to be successful because it is regulation that would require Senate to overrule that regulation or waive that regulation case. So no individual within the university has the right to overrule Senate. That would need to go to Senate. However, where there's judgment required for things around, for example, prerequisite waivers or things like that, then the students have the right to make that appeal. But they need to make the appeal at where the first decision occurred. So if a decision was made or the onus was on a course coordinator, then the appeal should be made to the course coordinator. If that is not successful or the student's not satisfied with the result of that, then they can escalate to that person's line supervisor, and that would then be the head of school. If the student's dissatisfied with that decision, they can escalate that higher to the dean. So we're following the university hierarchical structure of supervisory authority. And then ultimately, in that case of an academic decision, it could be raised with the DVC or with the VC. So in the Student Grievance Policy and Procedures, it has a clear flow chart and a table showing who you should contact in the first place. And it's very important you do that. The VC and the university has now agreed we will not consider any grievances that do not follow policy and procedures. So if you inappropriately go directly to the VC or the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, your grievance will not be investigated. You'll be referred to the Student Grievance Policy and Procedures and be asked to follow the policy and procedures. You can also challenge administrative decisions. In these cases, this often involves student administrative services. And that is your first process, is to make your grievance to the group manager of student administrative services. And then if she is not able to resolve that, then that can then be escalated to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor. You can also make complaints against what you perceive to be unfair treatment, with one exception, sexual harassment. The reason for that is sexual harassment has a separate policy on its own, and anyone who believes they've been subject to sexual harassment should follow that policy. If you look in the Student Grievance Policy and Procedures, it stipulates a number of other cases where there's already an appeals mechanism within a regulation or another policy, such as sexual harassment policy. The Student Grievance Policy and Procedures only apply to decisions or to issues that are not covered by other policies. So if the regulation and the handbook and calendar has an appeals process, you should follow that appeals process. You cannot follow the appeals process and then go through student grievance processes afterwards. That appeals process is the end of it. So each policy regulation, you would need to look and see whether there is any appeals process within that. If there's not, you can then go to the student grievance policy and procedures. If you're unsure, then you can approach the DVC's secretary and she will advise you as to whether your grievance concerns is captured within regulation or whether you should follow the student grievance policy and procedures. We sometimes get students wanting to make anonymous complaints, and whilst we understand why somebody might wish to do that, the typical reason proposed is that they wish to be protected because they feel that they might be victimised if they make a grievance. The university is not obligated to investigate anonymous complaints. The decision is whether to investigate or not rests with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and he or she will look at that case and see whether he thinks there's sufficient evidence and merit to warrant an investigation. And typically that will not go ahead. For no other reason than it's very difficult to get the full facts behind a case if the complaint is anonymous. There's a second reason why we'll commonly not investigate. This is a student grievance policy and procedures. This relates to students of USP. And there is the risk of mischievous allegations, false allegations made by somebody who's not part of the university, who's not part of the student body, and therefore the university, in a sense, is not answerable to those people. But as I say, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor has the opportunity to look at that and see if there's a matter of sufficient concern that he/she feels warrants investigation. The only other comment I wish to make is around the timing of the grievances. If we're going to investigate incidences or concerns, it becomes very difficult to do that properly a long time after the incident occurred. So the Student Grievance Policy and Procedure stipulates that grievances must be raised promptly and normally within 5 days. We say normally give a little bit of flexibility, but as I mentioned, the longer the gap between when the complaint was made and when the incident occurred makes it much more difficult for people to remember things. I'll just finish up by saying the main reason we developed the grievance procedures was to try and help have a smooth process where students can have genuine concerns raised and dealt with in a prompt and efficient and fair manner. It has an added benefit. Because the university now records all grievances because they're coming through the same procedures and policies, then we keep a register of student grievances. And that allows us to look at the concerns students have raised through this process and then to do an audit of that and see whether there's some systems issues perhaps that might be causing concerns. And let me give you one example of that. Academic advice. Students often complain that they were given advice by somebody which then conflicts with, for example, student administrative services when they come to graduate or when they come to satisfy the requirements of a degree. When we investigated these grievances that came through this process, we found that most of the times the students were seeking academic advice from people that are not authorised to give that advice. So as a response to that, university has now developed an academic advice framework which stipulates clearly to students and to staff, I might add, who is authorised to make what decisions. And by responding to the student grievance policy and procedures, we are now in a position to bring about improvements about the offering of academic advice, which should, we would hope, reduce the likelihood of these types of instances occurring. So students will be told explicitly if you want to get a waiver for a course, who they would need to go to. If you want to gain admission to a program, who do you go to, who is authorised to give you that advice. And that type of thing enables us to produce a much better system as a result of analysing student grievances. This register of student grievances is considered by the university's Teaching Quality Committee at its regular meetings, and that enables us to keep on top of those issues and to see where those issues might arise. So I'll sum up by emphasising that we want to have a fair, transparent and efficient system, but it's critical that students follow student grievance policy and procedures. If they fail to follow those procedures and try to bypass that by going to senior academics, their grievances will not be investigated. But we do undertake to investigate fairly and promptly all legitimate grievances submitted to us through the student grievance policy and procedures. Thank you.